Why do you think it is that we see ourselves in decline, and do you believe that we are?
I think that's a very interesting question, which would require. I'll try not to give it too long an answer. And could I start with a kind of anecdote in a way? I went to. You always learn in history. You always got much more to learn because you know such a lot of it for one thing. But I went to a talk given by one of my colleagues on medieval England, and he was talking about how well governed England was, what a remarkably participatory system of government it was. I think 40% of the adult population, at least of the male population, was in some way involved in government, which of course is much higher than now. It was a wealthy country. It was one in which the elites were not constantly fighting each other and fighting the king, that they all had an interest in things working well, and on the whole, they did work well. The only thing that went seriously wrong was if you had a seriously bad king. But you nowadays you might say that that could be a seriously bad politician elected too. So I don't think. So, and I said to him at the end, "Why do we have such a different idea about the past?" I sort of had an inkling of what he might say. But when the story is in many ways so good, why do we have such a pessimistic view of our history? People talk about, it's medieval, or people often say, how can this still be happening in the 21st century? As if we've reached a peak which no other generation in history could possibly have equaled. And his answer was, it really comes down to Whig history, which was the history of England and Britain, and indeed in some ways of the world, as told by the Whig Party from the 18th century onwards, which saw our history as one of struggle between people in Parliament, which saw the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and squalor and violence, and which was essentially a story of progress. There's a wonderful satire of this that you may know called 1066 and all that, which is supposed. It was written by a couple of school teachers, and it's about how school children were taught history in a sense, or what they picked up from it. And it was always about how things were getting better and better until England became the top nation, and then history stopped. You could say, well, that version of Whig history was exported to America, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, that's what they did think, that America was now the top nation and history had stopped. And we know that history never stops. But so what I was going to say is that our view of the past and our view of our past is very much, of course, a constructed thing. It's constructed by historians to some extent, but it's often constructed by politicians and intellectuals of all sorts who are trying to tell a particular story. And in this case, it was the story of what we might call the left, though they didn't use that term then. But it was all about the triumph of the left and how the values of the left came to be the values of the nation. And I think it started going wrong, because the story is supposed to end in triumph, and it starts going wrong when triumph seems to be eluding us, or things seem to be, for some reason, going wrong. So my point, first of all, is we have had a pretty lucky history, but we often haven't told it that way because it was a political narrative that was talking about the terrible days of the past and the wonderful days of the present. When the wonderful days of the present seem somehow to be not so wonderful, then you've got a kind of feeling of disappointment. What's gone wrong? And as you raise the point of decline, why are we in decline? And I would say to that, well, the idea of decline is a very dubious one. Decline from what? From when? To what? As we all know, we are now, and in some ways this is progress. We are richer than we've ever been. We live longer than we ever have. In some ways things are better. In some ways not better. In some ways perhaps not so good. But in many ways you can't talk about a downhill slope from some time in the past. There's no golden age. And I think that therefore the people who talk about decline and who are constantly lamenting the awful state of things, and I do that myself sometimes, should at least keep a sense of proportion and think to themselves, was there ever a golden age in the past? To which the answer is almost certainly not. And if we think there was, it's because we don't know enough about it. And also, are things really so bad now? And are they really so bad here? I mean, it may be that the people who tend to be very declinist about Britain may be having second thoughts when they see what's happening across the Channel in France or across the Atlantic in America. But I think, we have to say, yes, there are lots of things which we should be doing better, and there are problems we have which are quite serious. But to think of us in the state of terminal decline is really pretty silly, and probably damaging in the sense, at least, it creates, it saps the will, it creates a kind of cynicism, and I think that is something that we should be wary of. And if that's not already too long an answer, I'd say that the idea of decline is often, and I think you may have referred to this, is often people who say, well, once Britain was a superpower, and now we're just a medium-sized country. Well, this is simply wrong from both ends of the argument. Britain was never a superpower. It was always, and it's the people who ruled it always knew this. It was a relatively small country with a relatively small population, and for a time it had a very large empire. But then so did Portugal, so did Belgium, so did Holland. Didn't make them superpowers. And the British Empire was always a very ramshackle organization. As for now, I mean, people say, oh, we're only a medium-sized power. Well, I mean, medium-sized, you can look it up on lists of GDP, or you can look it up on lists of global defense spending and so on. Medium-sized powers are countries like Algeria. Britain is not a medium-sized power. Britain is, and I said this before, is what it has been for the past 300 years, one of the half dozen or so most powerful states in the world. And I think if we realize that we are a powerful but small state, not a declined superpower, but we are what we've always been, it might make us more able to see what our place in the world should really be, without either being too arrogant or too subservient. But, if people say, oh, well, surely we're in decline, I'd say, well, when in your view is the time in which Britain was the superpower? And I think if people ever answer that question, they tend to say either, well, in 1943, we were one of the big three and so on. Well, in 1943, we were mobilizing, but I can't remember the figure, 60% of our GDP for the war effort. The whole population was conscripted, including women, the only country who conscripted women. Well, we were making a huge effort then, but it wasn't an effort. It was an effort out of all proportion to our real size. Or people say, well, the Victorian age, Britain ruled the waves. Gladstone, Disraeli, Salisbury, all those people were very well aware of the vulnerability of Britain and the very limited nature of its power in the world. And I sometimes think, well, we're now we're probably the leading military power in Western Europe, which we've never been in our peacetime history before. It's an odd measure of decline. And we are doing quite a bit to help Ukraine against Russia. Gladstone, Disraeli I doubt they would ever have thought that it was Britain's role or Britain's capacity would enable us to be supporting a war on the frontiers of Russia. It would have been far outside what they thought of as our scope. So I think this idea of decline just simply doesn't fit the facts. And it's usually said by people who either have some sort of axe to grind or who really haven't got much of a sense of history. If that doesn't sound too arrogant, probably was.
No, I think when you're a professor emeritus of the history at Cambridge, I think you can say it from a position of authority, Robert. That can be accepted.
Not everybody in Cambridge would agree. But I think, one has to be willing to argue about these things and not just take them for granted. And history is about disagreement to a large extent. But they're disagreements that can usually be resolved by a careful look at the evidence and by trying to argue the case out. I mean, I think one of the things that's gone wrong with our historical discourse as a country is the belief that there's no truth in history. It's all just a lot of stories, and you can just choose the story you like. and that I think is very damaging too.